Hey there, drone fans. Rick here again from Drone Valley. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you new flyers out there. I know a lot of people have entered this hobby in the last couple of months, and maybe you got a quad as a gift over the holidays, or you've been thinking about buying a drone for a while and you found that some of these new manufacturers have built incredibly sophisticated technology that has seduced you to the point where you decided now's the time to make that purchase. Doesn't really matter how you got here. It's a wonderful thing that you're here. This hobby, from my perspective, is just an elevating experience. Every time I put the quad up, it's impossible for me to convey to you the freedom I feel and the fun I have flying that quad. And you're going to feel the same thing. And again, all of us have started exactly where you are. So whether you're brand new to this, or you've flown it a week, or you're just opening the box tomorrow, you're going to have a lot of questions, because buying a quad and flying a quad are really two different things completely. And you're going to realize pretty quickly that the minute you put that quad up in the air, you're going to have a ton of questions about a lot of different things. And I thought back to when I first started flying, and again, all of us started at the same point. All of us at one point decided we're going to fly a quad. We went out and we bought a cool quad, took it home, tore open the box, charged the battery, slapped that battery in the quad, put our thumbs on the controller, and sent that quad aloft. So all of us have started exactly at that same place, and most of us, if we're being honest, we're kind of unnerved about this thing flying in the backyard. Like, what could happen? Could it crash? Is it going to fly out of control? Should I even be flying it in my backyard? And then to move beyond that to a public setting where I'm flying it at the beach or a lake or over a forest, those take time to get used to that kind of stuff. So I thought back to my experiences and said, you know what? Based on all the questions I get on the YouTube channel from new flyers, I want to put a clip together that sort of helps people get past those concerns or those fears, if we're being honest, and get them in a place where they're comfortable flying, they feel competent, and they're better pilots. Because that's a good thing for the community in general, because right now it's a very ticklish time for public opinion about quads. You see stories on the news that tend to amp up all the horrible things that may happen because some knucklehead misbehaved with a quad. That's the story that gets time. That's not the experience. There are tens of thousands of people that fly these quads responsibly, and you don't hear about them because they're behaving and they're doing things by the rules. So back to the clip. Today I want to spend some time talking about what I consider to be 5 concerns that I had, or fears that I had, when I first started flying. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time in each of these sections, and I'm putting a timestamp below. So if you get bored with a section and you want to jump forward, you can jump forward to that particular timestamp. But the 5 sections I want to talk about today, the first section is on technology overload, which is you're buying this new sophisticated quad, which is really a robot flying in the air that has a brain of its own that can do things on its own. How do you come up to speed on something like that from never flying a quad before? So I'll talk about some of those technical challenges. The next one has to do with the rules. The one thing I wasn't clear about, and I see a lot of YouTube channels out there with kind of sketchy opinions about these things, I wasn't clear on where can I fly it and where can I fly it. So I'm going to talk about the rules, specifically what the FAA requires of you if you're going to put a quad up in the air, and then more importantly, some of the gray areas of where you can fly or can't fly that quad, or maybe shouldn't fly that quad. The third section has to do with what I consider to be an overblown category of conversation: crashes and flyaways. It seems like every third video out there talks about how a drone flew out of control and it went nuts, or it crashed on me and I didn't do anything wrong. My personal opinion, when I look at root cause of every time I've crashed a quad or had a flyaway, and I've had a few of them, it's been my fault. I've either flown too close to something I shouldn't have been flying close to, like a cell tower, or I've gotten near a tree and I've wound up parking it up in a branch of a tree. So I'll talk a little bit about, don't fear that stuff. Don't worry so much about your quad having a mind of its own and doing bizarre things. It's a really, really rare occurrence. And I'll talk a lot about maybe what the root causes are there, and you'll figure out very quickly that you have a lot of control over that quad and you shouldn't fear that stuff. The next one has to do with your personal maturity in the space, because you're going to put that quad up and very quickly realize, if it's got a decent camera on it, that you're capturing some really cool footage. And you're going to wonder, is this good enough to put up on the internet? Should I start a YouTube channel and start posting that? The second thing in that category is you're going to get to be a better flyer, and you're going to figure stuff out pretty quickly that maybe other people don't know. And you're going to wonder, should I put a clip together and explain that? I'm going to tell you yes on both counts. I'm going to tell you any footage you capture, put it together in a video and post it online, and anything you learn that you think would help the community, put a little clip together and put it up online, because you're going to find this community to be a very welcoming and inclusive community that helps each other and supports each other. And if you come up with something no one else has seen before, you're going to be a hero in this community. So I would encourage you to do both those things, and I'll talk a little bit about how you do that. The last section has to do with public reaction. I mentioned before how this is a ticklish time for the public. They're not quite sure what they think about drones. There are some that are galvanized against them. They're extremely aggressive about, you can't fly here, don't fly here. Most of the public at this point is incredibly curious about quads, and they want to know more about them. And if you're out there in the public, you've got to be ready for interacting with the public. If you're flying in your backyard, it's one thing. The minute you take it to a beach, people are going to want to know about that quad. So you've got to be ready for that. And I'll talk a little bit about how I can diffuse those situations and how I act, and you should act as an ambassador for this hobby, how you can waylay the fears of the public and get them encouraged and excited about flying a quad, and just some tips and tricks that I use to sort of diffuse that situation if it gets a little bit awkward. So anyway, those are the 5 sections I'm going to cover. I don't want to rush through this clip, so it's going to be a little longer than my normal clips, and I did that because I think each of these sections are super important, and you may not care about all 5 of them, but if there's one section you care about, I don't want to rush through it. I want to make sure I give you all the details you need to become a better flyer and really enjoy this hobby as much as you can. So anyway, stay tuned and I'll get started on this first section in a minute. First thing I'd like to discuss is technology overload. Now, quads today are way more sophisticated than they've ever been in the past. And when you think about the amount of overlapping systems that the manufacturers are able to squash into that tiny little flying machine, it's incredible to me that it even takes off, let alone allows me to control it at distance. So it took me a while to get comfortable with the concept of me having a controller that was dictating what that flying machine did. And if I think back to when I first started flying, all I really cared about was that that quad lifted off the ground a couple of feet, flew out 20 feet, spun around, flew back and landed. I would have been thrilled if it did that. So when I spun up those propellers and it did that, I was blown away. And if I'm being honest, what I thought about initially was that quad's going to realize it's found its freedom. The minute I spin up those propellers, it can do what it wants. It's going to levitate to 300 feet, head over a hill, and I'll be standing here frantically trying to control the thing to get it back. That didn't happen. It didn't happen the second time or the third time. So over a period of time, I got comfortable with the technology. I began to trust the tech. And then it allows you to do more sophisticated things. So what I would suggest as a starting point for you, if you're new to this, is don't try a lot of crazy maneuvers out of the gate. Don't turn on a lot of the advanced features. I know that technology sometimes can be seductive, and when you read through the manual and you see things like follow me mode or circle me mode or missions, you want to go right to the cool stuff. But this is the kind of hobby where you can build up to that over time, but you absolutely have to get good at the basics. You have to understand how to take off and land, how to control it, what the yaw and pitch do, you maybe even how to film. Don't start filming right away, just worry about flying that quad. So like anything in life, if you start simple and build on those basic skill sets or fundamental skill sets, you'll be much better as a pilot over the long term. So for me, that first flying lesson, if you will, in my backyard was a success, which then allowed me to fly 60 feet. Then it allowed me to take it out to a field where there were no trees around, nothing to hit, fly it out 100 yards, put it up 50 feet, bring it back down, put it up 100 feet, oh my gosh, bring it back down. And over time, you get much more comfortable with all those behaviors to the point where you feel like it's listening to me, it's not doing strange things on me, and I really am in control of that quad. So I feel confident that that machine is behaving the way I'd expect it to behave, and I trust that tech completely today. In addition to that, there's a couple other places you can go, because I know you're probably thirsty for information right now. I'm doing all I can to provide as much information as I can on certain brands of quads and models of quads, but there's a million other places you can go. So 5 places that I went to, or 5 things I did out of the gate that really helped me get more comfortable with the quad and understand some of those advanced features, which again, I'm going to recommend you turn on slowly over time and start playing with them once you get the basics down. Are these 5 places. So the first thing I would recommend, and I'm as guilty as this as anybody else, whenever I get a new piece of tech, the first thing I want to do is power it up and play with it. That works for most home appliances and electronics and things, but it's not a good idea with flying quads. So the first thing I'd recommend is, no matter how boring this sounds, read the manual. Break out the manual, read the manual. You'll find there's tons of nuance in there and different bits and pieces of information that are really, really critical to flying safely. Even the basics of how to fly the quad are in that manual. So start with that manual, read it. Again, as boring as it is, you'll thank me later. That's a great place to start. The second thing is, YouTube is a wonderful place to find instructional videos, tutorials, people flying quads, showing you how they fly them, show them where they fly them. So, get on YouTube. You're watching me on YouTube. There's 1,000 other pilots out there that are smarter than I am flying their quads. And what you'll find is there's a collective intelligence about flying the quads. When you watch a bunch of different clips, you'll get different perspectives on how people do things, and you'll find a common thread of sanity, if you will, in those clips that explain these different concepts. So between the manual and YouTube, you'll have a really good place to start understanding some of the features of the quad, especially the safety sides of things. But YouTube is a great place for you to sort of explore. If you're here looking at me, so you're probably doing it already, but again, as a recommendation, look for tutorials, look for hints and tips and tricks, look for accessory recommendations. Looking for flying examples is really good as well, because you'll get techniques on how to fly, techniques on how to film. So YouTube is a place that I went to an awful lot before I started putting the channel together. The next thing I spent a lot of time doing was finding message boards on the internet about a specific quad. So I started flying very simple quads in the beginning, then moved up to the Phantom series of quads. When I started flying the Phantoms, there are message boards that are specific to the Phantom model that you're flying. So if it's Phantom 3 Standard or a Phantom 4, you'll find a message board that only talks about Phantom 4, and they're very parsed out so that you can get into that section of the message board, and people you're reading things about really only fly Phantom 4, so there's tons of information there about how they fly and problems maybe they've seen, how they've corrected for those problems. That community, no matter which message board you're on, is self-policed, and they're usually very welcoming. So if you've got a question about a specific aspect and a little tiny bit of information you need on the quad, if you ask it on a message board, you'll be shocked at how many people rush in to answer that question for you. So message boards are a great place that I go to just to read general information about how the quads are doing. I certainly hit those message boards to check for firmware updates. Before I do a firmware update on my quad, I want to make sure other people have done it, and if they've stumbled over things in that update, maybe I don't do the update right away, but it keeps me sort of in the loop for changes in the community, and it's a great place to ask questions. The next thing I would talk about would be flying with a pilot. So I had a lot of friends that flew, so I got into it kind of late compared to some of my friends that were flying. And I've met people in this business for the last year or so that fly a lot, and they're in my area. So I spent a lot of time with experienced pilots, asking them questions, watching them fly, have them watch me fly for a little bit and explain to me how I could do things differently or how I'm not being as safe as I should be in this particular aspect or whatever. But experienced pilots really, to me, are volumes of information that you can get very, very quickly. So if you've got friends that fly, or you've got neighbors that fly, or maybe you can fly in your area, you can find a local flying club where there typically are members there that have been flying for decades. That'll be a great source of information to sort of put you on the right track very quickly, and you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that new flyers have by talking to experienced people. And you don't have to be there every week, but if you go there once or twice or 3 times, you'll be shocked at how much information you'll get from those flying clubs. So that's a great place to go. The fifth place that I spent a lot of time was on the manufacturer's website. Every quad manufacturer out there that's selling product today has a website. A lot of them have their own message boards on the website, but they also have maybe tutorial videos or introductory videos. They'll go through the nuances of how you can tune things inside the quad. So hit the manufacturer's website, look on their support pages too, because that's where they'll explain maybe what firmware updates do, maybe cautions on the quad or things that they've got about recalls or safety concerns. I don't check those that often, but if I'm on there once a month, just kind of parsing through that information to make sure that things that I'm flying are safe and that things haven't changed, based on firmware changes, is a good place to check as well. So those are the 5 places I'd go. But the best advice I can give you to overcome this technology overload is don't turn everything on at once. I know that the temptation is to go for the icing first before you eat the cake, but don't do that. Take your time, fly the basic quad. Even if it's incredibly sophisticated, just treat it as a dumb quad that you're going to fly around the backyard for a bit of time. Then slowly, as you get comfortable flying it, then turn on some of those cool features, because the worst thing that could happen is that you turn them all on, you fly the quad, heaven forbid you crash the quad, now you've got your investment in the ground someplace. But more than that, the minute that thing does something you don't expect it to do, good or bad, you don't trust it. And if you don't trust it, you'll never get good with it. So you've got to trust that technology. The way to do that is to do it slowly. So that's all I had in this section. So hang on and we'll get into the next one. Okay, this section is going to cover the rules and regulations for flying your quad. Now, this can be a very confusing section, especially for new flyers, and it can be very controversial as well. So I'm going to try and give you some background on how we got to where we are, and maybe what set of rules I fly by on a regular basis. Now, you would think that it'd be simple to answer the question, can I put my quad up at this location and fly safely? And it should be an easy answer, because there is a set of rules nationally that the FAA set up, and I'll talk about those specifically. But unfortunately, locally, a lot of municipalities and states and parks and even beaches have set up their own rules and regulations, because they've somehow decided that quads are a bigger danger than the federal government realizes, and they need a special ban in that particular area to control how hobbyists fly their quads. Very frustrating to me that we've got these 2 different sets of rules that I got to kind of figure out. So I always fly by the FAA rules, and I typically do a lot of research for an area I'm going to fly in before I put a quad up. Very easy to do. You get on Google, you put in quad ban or drone ban, and then the area you're going to fly in. Something should pop up if there's a local ban there, and I'm hoping that as time goes on, the FAA is going to get more involved in these local bans and sort of level the playing field so we all understand what the rules are. But at a bare minimum, you've got to follow the FAA rules. Before I get too deep into those, and I'll spend some time going through those individually, I want to talk about sort of the public reaction to quads, because that really comes into play here a little bit too. You have on one end of the spectrum, and this is where I talked about controversy, people that feel like they can fly anywhere they want. They're not going to pay attention to rules. They're going to put a quad up and fly it any way they want, and that's just the end of it. It's America. It's the land of the free. I kind of understand that to a certain extent, but you're putting a quad up in airspace with other aircraft, you're putting it around people. So you do have some responsibility to kind of fly by the rules. On the other end of that spectrum, you've got people that are saying, I don't want those quads up in the air at all. I don't want them near my property. Don't you dare fly over my house. That's unrealistic as well. So the opinion's kind of somewhere in the middle, and that's why I feel that the regulations the FAA put out are kind of a good happy medium to sort of fly under, because it does respect individual privacy and safety, and it does give you a ton of freedom to fly where you want. So my recommendation would be, as I go through these, please follow these regulations. I know it's an individual choice and you can do whatever you want. I'm just one guy talking. But I feel like the hobby is at a really pivotal point right now with public opinion, and public opinion dictates a lot of these regulations that are being created. So the worst thing that could happen is a bunch of us become cowboys, start flying these things like crazy, and have an accident with something serious. The regulations are going to come down very hard, and it's going to really limit what we can do. So enough about me with the soapbox. So the FAA regulations were published a little while ago. The most basic one you have to follow is if your craft is more than 0.55 pounds, you got to register the drone. You can decide not to register the drone, but the penalties and the legal aspects of what would happen if that crashed without a registration number on it are overbearing. So it's a simple process. I know a lot of people make a big deal out of it. It's a 5-minute process, costs you $5. You're done with it and you're set. So register your drone if you're going to fly your drone. That's my recommendation. The next one is you have to be very respectful of no-fly zones. Now, no-fly zones are usually set up around government buildings, nuclear power plants, electrical facilities, airports, and it's easy to figure out where a no-fly zone is because your cell phone, you can download applications that have maps of the US, maps of the world really, that have those no-fly zones identified. So the minute you spin up that application, it'll pinpoint where you're standing based on your GPS coordinates, and it'll tell you if you're in an area where you've got to worry about that kind of stuff. So I wouldn't say trust one app. There's probably 50 apps out there that do it. Maybe you get 2 apps and compare the 2. I always like to fire up one, make sure I'm clean, fire up another one, make sure it agrees with it, because those databases are being updated all the time, so it'll actually tell you, the most accurate details for the space you're standing in. So beware of the no-fly zones. Don't fly over them, because those are sensitive areas that if you're a worker at a nuclear power plant, all of a sudden a drone comes flying over, in these times of heightened security, it's not a good idea to do that. You're going to get a whole lot of attention very quickly, so don't do that. Respect those no-fly zones. All right, the other 2 things that drive me crazy, quite honestly, as a responsible drone pilot, and I know I'm going to get grief for this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because you guys are new to the hobby. There are 2 restrictions that have to do with how far and how high you can fly your drone. Under the FAA regulations, you have to keep your quad under 400 feet. You can't fly above 500 feet. Most high-end quads can fly 7 miles, and it doesn't matter if you're flying 7 miles out or 7 miles up. There's restrictions on how you should fly and how high you should fly. Respect those restrictions. 400 feet isn't a number they just plucked out of thin air. It's a number that's well below what commercial airliners will fly. So commercial airliners will fly pretty much with a floor of 500 feet unless they're landing or taking off. If you're up to 400 foot as a ceiling, there's a 100-foot buffer between you, which means you're never going to introduce yourself to a commercial airliner. So they build that buffer in for a good reason. Nothing frustrates me more than seeing some Yahoo on a YouTube channel flying up to 4,000 feet because they're putting their quad up in the area where planes are flying. The first time a quad impacts a plane, which has never happened up to this point, it's going to be bad for everybody. So stay under the 400 feet. That's plenty high. You can fly all over the place, see plenty of cool stuff up at 400 feet. Just respect the 400 feet. The second part that drives me crazy is the visual line of sight requirement. So you're obligated to always keep visual line of sight on your quad. Whenever you're flying it, you should be able to see that quad, whether it's black or white. You shouldn't fly it further than you can see it. You shouldn't fly it over a hill or behind trees. The reasons for that are that even though you can see through the camera on most of the modern quads, you can't see things around you. So even though the camera can present what's in front of you, you're not going to fly into a tree that way. You've got 180 degrees behind you for your peripheral vision, or a helicopter could be behind you, or a plane could be coming in for sort of an emergency procedure. You won't know that, and you're going to impact that plane. So the visual line of sight requirement is there to prevent accidents in the air, and if you have visual line of sight of your quad, you can see the area around it and know that you're not putting anybody in harm's way by flying it. What drives me nuts is a lot of people love to do these distance tests where they try to push the quad to its absolute limits to fly 6 and 7 miles out, and that may seem cool on paper, and even if you're in the desert and there's nothing around you, it may seem cool to do that and you think you're safe. If you're flying that far away, you can't tell that drone is out of your sight what exactly is going on around that drone. So please respect both the height and the visual line of sight. And I know I'm going to get grief for this because people love to do it and they're like, oh, I'm a safe flyer, but that's the rules. You got to play by the rules. All right, the next one which drives people nuts is don't fly over people. You're not allowed to fly over crowds. You're not allowed to fly directly over people that aren't involved in the video or don't have permission for. So if you're flying at a wedding, everybody there is fine with you flying over the people and taking shots. But if you're at a beach, you can't fly over people. And the reason for that, again, common sense, is that the drones, even though there's tons of fail-safes built into them, if that drone has a major failure and starts falling out of the sky like a rock, rock, if that lands on somebody, it could cause some real damage there. So if you're flying the drone on a beach or in a park or anywhere else, fly over buildings, fly over cars, fly over anything you want, just don't fly over people. Make sure you fly around people. The next thing I'll talk about is the airport restriction. So airports are kind of a golden zone where you can't fly within 5 miles of an airport. I know that frustrates a lot of people because if you live within 5 miles of an airport, and I was shocked at how many airports there are in the United States, big and small, but if you live within 5 miles of the airport, you can't even put it up in your backyard, which kind of seems goofy because if you put it up 30 feet, who's going to care? But you're violating the law. So again, that application I talked about before will tell you if you're within 5 miles of an airport, and then you'll know you're in a restricted zone. If you have one of the sophisticated aircraft, like a lot of the high-end DJI products, they actually have no-fly capabilities built into it. So if you try to put the quad up and go into a no-fly zone or close to an airport, it'll stop you from flying into that. So there's this imaginary geofencing around it that stops you. I think that's a safe thing because I really, as much as I love my hobby and I want to fly everywhere I can fly, I have to respect the commercial air stuff going on up there. So the commercial airliners really have right of way up there. So just respect that 5 miles of the airport. If you have to fly closer to the airport, you can call the tower and you can ask for permission. In a lot of cases, they'll grant you that permission as long as you tell them how high you're going to fly and where you're going to fly. So if you have to fly within the airport, make sure you call the tower and get permission for that. The last thing I'll talk about from a regulation perspective is don't fly under the influence. So if you're drinking and you're not feeling yourself and you're feeling a little bit good that day, don't put the craft up. My rule of thumb is if I'm incapacitated where I shouldn't be driving because I've been drinking or whatever, I don't fly the quad. There's nothing good that's going to come from that, quite honestly. And I know I sound preachy here, but I spend a lot of money on that craft. The last thing I want to do is be in one of those moods where I'm flying the thing and crash that quad, right? So you can't fly under the influence. And honestly, if you're caught flying under the influence, it's going to be bad for you in a lot of ways. So that's the last thing I'll talk about. So those are the basics of what the FAA has. And again, I've got a link below that explains them in detail. I would suggest you read through it. Those to me are all common sense rules. There's nothing in there that says, gee, you know, why did they come up with that rule? That seems pretty goofy. They're all pretty common sense rules. So I'm a pretty by the book kind of guy. I fly by those rules. And if you fly by them on a regular basis, they'll become second nature to you. And for me, it just makes the hobby safer. And I want it to be safe because I want you guys to be able to fly for a long period of time. The first couple guys that do dumb things are going to ruin it for everybody, just like everything else in life. So if you're going to start this hobby, start it responsibly, follow the rules, and you'll be good to go. All right, now that we get the FAA out of the way, the last thing I want to talk about is public opinion, and I'll get into this more in the last section of this conversation, but there's a lot of people out there that really don't understand what quads are about, and they're afraid of privacy and safety issues. And you'll get a lot of people in the public where you may have done all your research, you're flying in an area you're allowed to fly, and people are going to come up to you and say, put that drone down, I don't want you flying near my house or near this beach or near this park. You have to be ready for that. And I'll talk a lot about how you can diffuse some of those situations at the end, but what I'll say in this particular section is know your rules. And the conversation I typically have with those people would be along the lines of, look, I'm following the FAA regulations. There are no local bans in place. I'm flying very safely. I've registered my drone. I've done everything right to enjoy this hobby. Why don't you take a look at the controller and look how cool that video is? And maybe even give them a chance to play with the sticks a little bit so they get a feel for how much fun it is to actually put a craft up in the air and fly it. But you got to be ready for that because even though you're doing everything right, some people are going to be offended by the fact that you've got this quad up in the air and they're going to question you on it. So my rule of thumb is understand what the regulations are, make sure that you're ready to defend those pretty much anywhere you're flying. This section has to do with crashes and flyaways, which is probably the single biggest fear of most new pilots, and I understand that completely. The thought that your brand new quad that you've researched for months, you've probably waited weeks for it to arrive, and you've certainly spent a lot of your hard-earned cash on, could one day lose its mind, take off, and disappear over the horizon in a flyaway, or worse yet, in front of you, misbehave, come plummeting to the earth and bury itself in the ground. It's a terrifying concept. But I'm here to tell you, I think that fear is overblown. And I'll give you a couple of examples why. And I think for myself, I worried about it more than I should have when I first started flying, because like you, I probably did a lot of research where I'm looking on YouTube for the particular model of quad I was thinking of flying, and I found other clips out there where somebody had said, my model of quad crash, my model of quad fly away, and I watched those clips and it worried me that, geez, is this thing really that unreliable that I'm going to put it in the air and I'm going to lose it? Having flown as long as I have, the hundreds of hours of flight time that I've had on a bunch of different models of quad, I'm here to tell you that every time I've had a crash, and I've had plenty of them, or every time I've had a flyaway and I've had one of those, I can trace it back to something I did wrong. It was a pilot error. And if I expand that experience to all the people I fly with, all the friends that have quads, the thousands of hours of flight time they've had, every single time we've talked about a crash or a flyaway they've had, which is rare, has been a pilot error. It's been something they've either done wrong before they took off or something they did wrong when they were flying that craft. I'm not saying they don't happen. I'm just saying they're a lot more rare than people lead you to believe. So I'm going to divide this clip into two sections. The first section has to do with things you can do before you fly to minimize the chances of trouble. The second has to do with things you want to be aware of when you're flying, again, to minimize the chances of trouble. So let me talk about the stuff you do before you fly. If you think about a commercial pilot, and you're really a pilot if you're flying a quad, you're not a commercial pilot, but you're still a pilot nonetheless. A commercial pilot doesn't just jump in the seat of that jet and run off to the runway and take off. They talk to the tower an awful lot. They make sure coordinates are entered. They look for red blinking lights and that everything's blinking green. Then they get up out of their seat, they go down to the bottom of the plane, and they do an inspection, a physical inspection of the plane. They look at the tires and the suspension, and they look for oil leaks and make sure things are bolted on and tight. And then they get back in the plane and they fly, because as a pilot, you're responsible for the airworthiness of that craft. So a quad is no different. You've got to do a pre-flight inspection. So what I recommend is before you ever take off for the day, in other words, if you're going to fly, the first thing you do before you put the quad up is inspect the craft and go through this pre-flight checklist that I suggest you put together that calls out everything you want to check before that craft is ever flown. Before you spin up those rotors, you want to check these 10 or 11 things, whatever it happens to be. Now, I've done a clip on the 3 reasons that quads crash more often, and you can watch that clip and it'll give you some hints as to what you want to check. But there's a ton of these pre-flight checklists out there that you can find that'll go through pretty much the same type of things you're checking, and I'll give you some hints as to what you want to watch. So you're looking for single points of failure that'll bring that quad down out of the sky. The first one you want to check is the battery. If the power supply fails, the quad's coming out of the sky. So you want to make sure the batteries are fully charged, they're in good shape, there's no bulging. When you slide the battery into the quad, you want to make sure it clicks and it's fully seated. Sometimes it'll click and it's not all the way in. You put it up in the air, you make a turn, the battery backs out a little bit, you lose power, the quad's coming down. If you have a smaller quad, there's a set of connections. You want to make sure those are fully seated. You want to make sure they click. The battery's securely mounted to the quad. All those things are really important from a power perspective. The second place you want to check are the blades. You need all 4 blades to keep the quad in the air. So if one of those blades pops off, it's coming down. That'll happen. And the way you prevent that from happening is pull all 4 blades off. Before you go up for the first flight of the day, pull all the blades off the quad. Check the mounting bases. Make sure the mounting bases are tight. There's no screws missing. There's no fractures. There's no frays. If those are clean, take each blade individually and inspect the blade to make sure there's no fractures, there's no nicks, there's no debris on the blades. Flip them over, make sure the mounting housings are secure and they're in there tight and the plastic's intact. If that's all done, put the blades on one at a time and make sure the blades are nice and tight. A lot of pilots will put the craft away and assume the blades are tight, but they can shake loose during transit. So you always want to check these things before you take off. If you take those steps, which again take a minute or two, it's not like you're there for an hour doing this stuff, you can minimize a lot of the reasons that these crafts actually fail. So those 2 things alone will prevent a lot of your crashes. So that's the stuff you do beforehand. And again, go through that entire pre-flight checklist. When you're flying the craft, there's a lot of things as a pilot you should pay attention to. So the first thing has to do with your attitude for the day. If you take the Part 107 exam, or if you've studied any kind of flight school information, there's a huge section in that exam about pilot attitude. And it has to do with hurrying through steps that you should be taking your time with, maybe a cavalier attitude, maybe being a little bit too excited about flying and not paying attention to the small details. So as a pilot, you'll notice most of them are very contemplative people. They don't rush into decisions. They're very slow to make decisions, but they make the right decisions. As a pilot, you've got to be in that mindset. So don't, as excited as I get when I go to a location, don't rush into the flight. Take your time and actually make sure your quad's ready to go. When that's done, just let it sit there. Then you've got to inspect the area you're at. So if you're flying in a new area, you want to check and make sure you know what the tallest object in that area would be. So if you're flying, you want to make sure that if it's 200 feet, your quad is above that, because if you're flying out or coming back, you don't want to impact a tree or something that's that tall. You want to check for guy wires. A lot of times there are guy wires holding up towers or holding up trees or a lot of other things that may not be apparent. So I always tend to walk the area I'm going to fly before I fly. I also want to make sure there's no electronic interference. One of the things that'll bring a quad down very quickly is a cell tower, because even though the cell tower itself is safe, if you fly a quad near it, you're flying a quad with a communication channel that's in that same bandwidth as most of the cell towers, and it's not like it's going to prevent the communication between the quad and the controller. What happens instead is it floods the channel with a lot of noise. So much like if you're at a party and there's a lot of people talking, you could be standing right next to your date and you can't even hear what she's saying because all the other noise crowds out the conversation. That's exactly what happens if you have a large source of noise in the area you're flying. So for me, I'll do a scan of the area. If I see a cell tower, I'm not putting the drone up. I just am that conservative, because the one time I've had a flyaway, it's because I've flown near a cell tower, and I think the communication between the quad and the actual controller was just overwritten by a lot of that noise from the cell tower. So that's just a precaution I take. The other thing is your pilot skills will mature over time. So when you start out as a new pilot, like I'd recommend in one of the other sections, take your time to learn to fly the quad. And I'm not preaching to you here, I'm just trying to prevent an expensive crash on your quad. Really take some time to learn how to fly it, how to do squares, how to do circles, get comfortable with going to 100, 200 feet. Once you get that down, then you can be a little bit more adventurous when you get out in the field to fly it a little further. The times that I've seen crashes with pilots that I fly with has because they've flown beyond their capabilities as a pilot. So it's the first time they've decided to fly over a lake, the first time they've tried to fly between trees, they crash. And maybe that's a learning experience to a certain extent, and it's okay if you're doing it in the woods where nobody's around you, but just be ready for those kind of things. If you try to extend your skill set beyond what you're capable of too quickly, that can introduce a lot of these problems. So again, I'm not saying all these things together are going to prevent every crash and every flyaway. All of us crash the craft. And I said at the beginning of this clip that I would be as honest as I could be. I've crashed a lot of times. I crash on a regular basis. I feel like an idiot every time I do it, but every time I do it, I learn from why I crashed. I'll tell you the truth. The second time I flew the quad, going back years, I put the quad up, flew it out 30 yards in my backyard, flew it back, it landed. I felt like a king. I felt like I can do anything with this quad. I immediately put it back up, flew it to the backyard, flew it home, and ran it right into the house and crashed the quad. So I've got a lot of experience crashing quads, but for me it's a learning experience. So don't feel bad when you crash it. It's going to happen. Just try to do it at a low height so you're not going to destroy the quad. Try to do it as little as possible. That's really the goal here. So that's all I wanted to cover in this section. Again, I've got clips on the channel that talk about it in more depth, so you may want to look through those. But don't fear this crash and flyaway stuff. I think there's a lot of noise being made about it out there, like let's blame the manufacturer, let's blame the technology. Again, as an engineer, I've researched these things extensively. This technology is the most sophisticated it's ever been and the most reliable. Don't fear the tech. This section has to do with what I like to call interesting footage, and it's less of a fear and more of a comfort level for most new pilots. It has to do with when a new pilot first starts flying their quad and they've got a camera on it, they may capture some amazing footage of their area. And they think to themselves when they get home, gee, that's great, I really enjoyed that and I love looking at that footage, but would anybody else care about this? Should I really take the time to post this on the internet? People may not like it, people are going to complain about it. I'm here to tell you, post that footage. And I know it takes a while for you to get used to the fact that other people may watch that footage and enjoy it, but I can't tell you how many times I've visited somebody else's channel that has taken footage of a beautiful area of the world that I've never been to, and I've watched that footage and it's touched me emotionally to the point where I think to myself, I want to go there. That's a place I definitely want to see firsthand. I don't live near you. You may live in one of those areas. I try to post as much footage as I can of my area here in the tri-state area. It's not as beautiful as some areas of the country, but it's got some interesting sights. But post that footage. I'm here to tell you, you don't need to think about it twice. Put together a little clip of your best shots and put one up a week. You're going to feel good about it. I'm going to enjoy it. Other flyers are going to enjoy it. And honestly, it's an inclusive community, so we're going to watch it. We may learn things from you about how you did that footage and where you live and the beauty of the area that you're flying in. It's an uplifting experience for everybody. The other side benefit of that, as I've mentioned before, that this is a ticklish time for public perception of quads. The more footage that's out there that shows the beauty of this country, whether it be an ocean or a cornfield or a mountain shot, the public looks at that and says, oh my gosh, I never had a clue that these drones would actually capture this kind of footage. That's gorgeous from the sky. I can't believe the video montage this guy put together. It's a positive experience that helps to outweigh the idiot clips where people are flying into buildings and everybody's got that impression of quads being dangerous. So you're helping all of us by putting that footage up. I'm here to encourage you to do that. Nobody will tell you that typically, but I'm here to tell you, post that footage every chance you get. The other thing I would encourage you to do is if you're flying your quad an awful lot, you're going to be more familiar with that quad than other people will be because it's your baby. So you're going to learn things about that quad others may not know. So if you fly that a lot and you discover something you think is unique, put a little clip together and talk about how you did this adjustment or you flew it this way to get this shot. And people are going to appreciate that. It's an inclusive community. We all learn from each other. I've learned tons of what I do today as a regular thing from other people's clips. I'm constantly out there searching other clips to find techniques and tips and tricks about quads that I can incorporate into my flying experience. We all get smarter together, which is a really good thing. So I'm here to encourage you to put your personal clips up, put your tutorials up, find a place to post them. YouTube is free. You can put a YouTube channel together in about 10 minutes, post your clips on there. Make sure other people know about them. We'll share them, we'll subscribe, and we'll watch them because it is It again is a very big brotherhood of people that fly together. It's a wonderful community, very supportive, and we appreciate all that footage being put out there because we'll all get smarter together over time as more of us put that kind of footage up. So that's all I wanted to say in this portion of the clip. But if you ever hesitate about footage you've got and posting it on the internet, don't think twice about it. Post those clips. Okay, this last section has to do with public reaction, and this is a big fear for a lot of flyers, and I've left it to the last because it can be a little bit tricky to deal with. And the public reaction to quads, as I've said a couple times throughout this clip, is kind of up in the air at this point. It's kind of on both sides of the fence where some are curious about it, some really enjoy them because they fly them or friends or family members that fly them, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where people can't stand them, feel that they're a safety hazard, they're an invasion of privacy, and you're going to encounter all those people because flying that quad in your backyard where it's a private circumstance is dramatically different than taking it to any public environment, whether it be a beach or a park or the mountains. The minute you put that quad up and people hear it, they're going to look around for who's got the controller, and more often than not, they're going to want to come over and talk to you. It's not always an aggressive thing. Sometimes they'll come over out of curiosity. More often than not, it's curiosity. But every now and then, you'll get somebody coming over to you, demanding you land that quad, demanding to see the pictures and all the aggressiveness that can come with that. So, like it or not, you've got to be ready for that encounter. You've got to be ready to sort of explain it and diffuse it. It doesn't do you any good at all to argue with that person. For starters, your quad's still up in the air, so you've got to contend with that. But what I like to do in most cases, especially when I get somebody who's fairly aggressive, is I'll talk to them about what I'm doing, explain that I'm flying within the FAA regulations, my quad's registered, I have my registration certificate with me. When I land the quad, I'm happy to show them. But the more you talk to them, that situation becomes friendlier and friendlier as that conversation ensues. And then I'll typically spin the controller around and show them exactly what the picture from the quad down looks like, which can be a very disarming thing with people that haven't seen footage from a quad before, looking at that display and seeing what you're seeing and realizing that that quad's up 150 feet in the air and you're getting this footage from it is enchanting for a lot of people. So it is an easy thing to do to sort of get them involved with the quad and understand the technology behind it and understand the benefits of what a quad can do. And like it or not, all of us are ambassadors for this hobby. It's a burden to carry, but you've got to be ready for that. So when the public approaches you, be ready with the conversation, sort of have it rehearsed in your mind. One thing that works really well for me in addition to that, and this is a tiny little bit of expense, but it'll save you a lot of headaches, is I printed up business cards. You can set up a Gmail account free. You can do it in 30 seconds. Set up a Gmail account. Get a business card printed. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Put a little quad logo on it. Just put a business card with your email address on it. And that way, if people are coming up to you about the quad, you can spin that quad around, bring it down to 50 feet, far enough away from everybody, and do a group shot. Or maybe take a couple of shots of their kids if they want you to do that, or their car, whatever they happen to want to look at. Say, look, I'd be happy to take a picture of this. Just send me an email and I'll send you a copy of the picture. That gets them engaged in this activity for the day, gives them something to look forward to. If you've got a YouTube channel, put that on the card as well. That way when they go home that night, they'll view your YouTube channel, they'll see all the other videos you've taken and all the things you've done with your quad and all the places you've traveled with it. Again, it's an experience that's different for them. And the reason it's so important for you to be an ambassador for this hobby is that these next 2 years are going to be a big decision time for the public and how they feel about quads. And I guarantee you, every time they hear a horror story about a quad, they're going to repeat it to 50 other people about, oh, I heard about this one that crashed, and what about this idiot that flew into a building? The more you can get out there with the positive aspects of quads allows them to be ready to defend quads when those conversations start. And I know I sound dramatic about this, but it really is a pivotal time for us because a lot of communities are misinformed about what quads can do and how safe they really are. And the more horror stories that come out, that tends to guide legislation and opinion and regulations, which is not good for us. I mean, as a hobby, I fly responsibly. I'm sure you guys fly responsibly, and you new pilots will fly responsibly as well. But the more people that get scared about this, the more reaction that results in legislation for us. So as a quad flyer, a good quad flyer, you're going to want to be an ambassador for this. So the business cards, take a picture, engage the public, be ready with a talk track that's honest about what you're doing with the quad and all the places you've flown. Try not to do too much talking while you're flying. If the conversation becomes larger and there's more people involved, bring the quad down and then turn and talk to those people. But at the end of the day, the public reaction is something that's unpredictable, unavoidable, and something you should be ready for, and it can be a very positive experience because in my little bit of flying in the years I've been flying, I would say the vast majority of encounters, probably 80% or better of those encounters, have been very positive encounters. They've been inquisitive people that were blown away by the technology, that were curious about it, that said, oh man, you just made up my mind. I'm going to go buy one of these things. I really think this is cool. So every now and then you'll get one that's a bit of a wingnut, to be expected. That's just the way life is. But more often than not, they're going to be friends when they leave as opposed to foes. So that's all I really wanted to say about that. That's all I had for this clip, and I know it was longer than the clips I normally do. I actually thought about breaking it up, but I felt like keeping it together would give you a better view of all these different fears. And my perspective on this is I thought long and hard about things I was worried about when I first started flying and how I got past those fears. And I'm hopeful that by explaining some of the things that I do to sort of make my piloting experience safer and better, that it helps you along that journey. I will tell you, this is a wonderful hobby, and I've been doing it for quite some time. It's very addictive. You're going to find that the more you fly, the more you're going to want to fly. I can't tell you the joy that I derive from this hobby, whether I'm flying alone or I bring my kids or my family along or flying with friends. It's just one of those experiences that's really difficult to describe adequately unless you've done it a bunch, and I'm hoping you feel the same thing. My big fear would be that you rush through some of this stuff, have a horrible crash, and then get turned off to the hobby, because I'm here to tell you it's one of those things you can do for a long time, and it just gets better over time. So just to summarize what we talked about today so far, have fun when you're flying. Just take your time, learn the skills. You're going to get better at it over time. All of us start at where you are today. So just enjoy it and have fun. Spread the joy. Talk to other people about what you like about this hobby. Show them the pictures, post your videos. Make sure people really understand why you're spending all these hours out in the field with a controller in your hand staring at the skies, because it's an amazing thing to do. If you get into trouble when you're flying, the two things to remember are take your thumbs off the controller. Most of the quads are going to hover where they are and you can recover from that. If all hell breaks loose, hit the return to home key and hopefully that quad will fly back to you and you can land it in a safe place. At the end of the day, we're all ambassadors for this hobby, and I know I've stressed that a couple times in the clip, but this is a delicate time for quads in general from a public perspective, regulatory perspective. So when you're out there flying, spread that joy. Let other people know how much fun you're having and show them what you're doing with that quad. And I'm telling you, it's going to turn them around. It's going to turn maybe foes into fans. So anyway, that's all I had today. If you have questions on things that maybe I missed in the clip, please drop them below. I'll respond as quickly as I can. If you like the clip, the thumb up is good. If you give me a thumbs down, at least explain why you did it. Send me a comment and say, hey Rick, we got tired of you talking. I did put time codes again below, so if you do get bored with me talking, you can skip ahead and get to a section that you care more about. But I really enjoy doing these clips. I'm hoping that you're finding value in them. I'll continue to do them as long as you guys are having fun watching them. So thanks an awful lot for tuning in today, and happy flying.